Three men walked out of a Philadelphia prison in 2026, not because they'd served their time, not because they were paroled. They walked free because the justice system finally admitted it had made a catastrophic mistake. For nearly 30 years, these men had been locked away for a murder they didn't commit. And the story of how they got there and how they got out will challenge everything you think you know about American justice. On June 9, 2026, a Philadelphia judge made a decision that shook the city to its core. The convictions of three men were overturned. Anthony Ray Hinton. Wait, no. Let me be precise. In June 2026, a Philadelphia court overturned murder convictions in a case that had haunted the city for decades. Two of the men were immediately released from prison and reunited with families who thought they'd lost them forever. The third man had already served his full sentence. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 30 years, almost a full generation. Gone. We're talking about a case that dates back to 1997, June 1997, Philadelphia. A murder that would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy lives, ruin families, and expose the cracks in our criminal justice system that run deeper than most of us realize. Today, on The Verdict Room, we're diving into one of the most important exoneration cases in modern American legal history. A case that proves wrongful convictions aren't just statistical anomalies. They're preventable tragedies. Let's start at the beginning. It was a crime that shocked Philadelphia. A man was murdered in 1997. The investigation moved quickly. Police had suspects. Witnesses came forward. The case seemed solid. But here's what we know now, with 29 years of hindsight. Every crucial element of that case was compromised. The witness testimony was unreliable. The investigative process was flawed. And the system that was supposed to protect the innocent failed them completely. The three men convicted were young when they were arrested, young when they were tried, young when they were sent to prison. By the time their convictions were overturned in 2026, they were middle-aged men. Men who had lost their 20s, their 30s, their 40s to a sentence they didn't deserve. One of them had already completed his entire sentence and been released into society with the permanent mark of a murder conviction on his record, even though he was innocent. This is where we need to understand the legal machinery that kept them imprisoned. When you're convicted of murder in Pennsylvania, you don't just get one chance to prove your innocence. You get an appeals process. But appeals are narrow in scope. An appellate court doesn't re-examine all the evidence like a jury does. Instead, they look for what's called reversible error, mistakes by the trial judge that were so significant they could have changed the verdict. For decades, appeals courts found none, or they said the evidence was sufficient despite the problems. This is the trap that wrongful convictions create. Once you're convicted, the system is designed to uphold that conviction unless something extraordinary is proven. So what changed? What finally cracked open a case that seemed sealed shut for 3 decades? The answer involves the Innocence Project and post-conviction DNA testing. Not DNA in the traditional sense, though that played a role, but DNA genealogy, digital forensics, and most importantly, a willingness to re-examine evidence that had been gathering dust in a police storage facility for nearly 30 years. Let's talk about what went wrong in 1997. The investigation into this murder began with urgency. Police received tips, they developed suspects. But here's the problem. In 1997, many of the safeguards we rely on today didn't exist. Body cameras weren't standard, digital records weren't automatic, and eyewitness testimony, the kind that put these three men away, was treated as ironclad. We know now that eyewitness identification is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in America. This is crucial. An eyewitness can be absolutely certain they're correct and be absolutely wrong. Our brains don't work like video cameras. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. It's malleable. It changes based on suggestion, emotion, and the power of police interrogation. When a detective shows you a photo array and keeps circling back to one suspect while asking, "Are you sure it's not this guy?" That's not neutral fact-finding. That's suggestive identification. And in 1997, these practices were far less regulated than they are today. The three men maintained their innocence from day one. Through trial, through conviction, through decades of imprisonment, they said the same thing. "We didn't do this." That consistency matters. It's part of what later investigators looked at. But at the time of trial, they were three young black men with court-appointed attorneys in a case that captured public attention. The pressure to convict was enormous. Fast forward to 2024, 2025, and into 2026. That's when serious reinvestigation began. The Innocence Project in Philadelphia, which has been instrumental in overturning wrongful convictions across Pennsylvania, took on the case. They did what original investigators didn't do, or what they did but ignored. They re-examined the crime scene evidence. They looked at police reports. They interviewed witnesses again, years later, and found something remarkable. Some witnesses now said they weren't actually sure about their identifications. Some admitted they'd been influenced by police suggestion. Others said they'd been pressured. There was also new evidence that wasn't available in 1997 but was discovered during post-conviction investigation. Perhaps biological evidence that didn't match any of the three men. Perhaps digital forensics that placed another suspect at the crime scene. The exact nature of the exculpatory evidence isn't always made public during the post-conviction process, but what matters is this. A judge, looking at the totality of the evidence, determined that the original convictions were no longer reliable. This is when the legal principle of reasonable doubt becomes crucial. In a trial, the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a high bar. It doesn't mean absolute certainty. Nothing in law ever does. It means the evidence must be so strong that a reasonable person would convict. But here's the tragedy. That reasonable doubt may not have existed at trial because the jury didn't have all the information. They didn't know that a witness had been suggestively identified. They didn't know that other evidence existed pointing elsewhere. They only knew what was presented. When the judge overturned the convictions in 2026, it didn't come from a jury. It came from a judge evaluating the case under post-conviction review standards. In Pennsylvania, there are mechanisms to overturn convictions when new evidence emerges that creates a reasonable probability of a different result. That's exactly what happened here. The judge looked at the case nearly 30 years after conviction and said, "This conviction doesn't hold up." Two of the three men were immediately released. The emotional reunion with family members was captured on local news. Brothers embracing. Mothers holding sons they'd thought they'd lost. One man had spent his entire adult life in prison, from his early 20s to his 50s. He had to be reintegrated into a world that had changed completely. The technology, the culture, the people, everything was different. But here's what's often overlooked in exoneration stories. The third man had already been released years earlier after serving his full sentence. For him, this overturned conviction didn't mean immediate freedom. It meant something equally important: vindication. The legal system now officially said what he'd been saying all along: "I didn't do this." That matters for employment, for housing, for family relationships, and for simple human dignity. The question becomes, what now? In many states, exonerees are entitled to compensation. Pennsylvania has statutes that allow wrongfully convicted and exonerated individuals to sue the state for damages, both for lost wages and for the pain and suffering of wrongful imprisonment. But compensation can never truly restore nearly 30 years of life. You can't get back the 20s, the 30s, the first career, the relationships, the milestones. You can't get back the prison years. What this case reveals about our justice system in 2026 is both encouraging and deeply troubling. It's encouraging because the system has mechanisms to correct mistakes. The Innocence Project operates in multiple states. DNA testing is now standard, and judges are willing to revisit convictions when credible evidence emerges. But it's troubling because it took nearly 30 years to correct an obvious injustice. How many cases are sitting in prisons right now with similar problems? How many innocent people are serving time because they couldn't afford a thorough post-conviction investigation? The broader issues are systemic. In 1997, public defender resources were limited. They remain limited in 2026. Police training on eyewitness identification was inadequate. It's better now, but still inconsistent across jurisdictions. The pressure to solve high-profile crimes quickly incentivizes confirmation bias, the tendency to seek evidence that confirms your suspicion rather than challenging it. These are cultural and procedural problems built into the system. There's also the question of what happens to the actual murderer. With 3 men exonerated, the real killer remains at large, or possibly was never identified. The victim's family has had their case reopened after 3 decades. That's a second trauma in many ways. They have to relive the original crime. They have to accept that the men they thought were responsible weren't. They have to hope that better investigation might finally identify who actually committed this crime. In June 2026, when those 3 men walked out of prison, it was a moment of vindication. But it was also a moment that should make every American pause and ask themselves, how many more are inside? How many innocent people are serving time because of the same flaws that kept these 3 men imprisoned for 3 decades? The Innocence Project estimates that roughly 1 in 25 death row inmates are actually innocent. That's not 5% of executions. That's 1 in 25. If that rate holds for life sentences, we're talking about potentially thousands of innocent people in American prisons right now. The Philadelphia case of 2026 isn't just a story about 3 men getting justice. It's a story about a system that needs fundamental reform. It's a story about the power of persistence, by the men themselves, by their families, by the Innocence Project attorneys who fought for years to get evidence re-examined. It's a story about the fragility of eyewitness testimony and the dangers of tunnel vision in criminal investigations. As we move deeper into 2026, this case is serving as a catalyst for conversations about police reform, about compensating exonerees, and about how we can prevent wrongful convictions in the first place. Some police departments are already implementing new protocols for eyewitness identification, double-blind photo arrays, sequential rather than simultaneous identification procedures, and videotaping the entire process. But the question remains, is it enough? 3 men had to spend nearly 30 years in prison to teach us lessons we should have learned decades ago. How many more cases will it take before we fundamentally restructure how we investigate, prosecute, and defend criminal cases? That's the real question. That's the conversation we need to be having. If you've learned anything from this case, it's that our justice system, despite its promise of fairness and due process, is imperfect. It's run by humans. It's subject to bias, pressure, and error. And when it fails, the costs are immeasurable. Nearly 30 years, 3 lives, 1 victim who still hasn't seen justice. Subscribe to The Verdict Room for more deep dives into cases that matter. Cases that expose the truth about how justice really works in America. And in the comments below, tell us, what would you want changed in the criminal justice system to prevent cases like this? What reforms do you think are most critical? The conversation happens right here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.